Yeah. Welcome back. Welcome back. Today on the docket, it's a very important conversation that you and I are gonna have. This is gonna kick off video 1 of the series, and the series is how to build a Franklin style, Texas style offset smoker. Me specifically, I'm building a big one. I'm building, I'm building the big mama of smokers. It's a 500-gallon offset smoker. And so if you didn't watch the first video, I'm going to detail this journey in depth. And so this is video number 1, so welcome. Today we're gonna talk about all things tanks, propane tanks to be specific. And I think the title of this video is gonna be Tank Talk. That's strong, okay? So tank talk today, we're gonna break down what kind of tanks are you looking for, where to find tanks, what do you do when you find your tank, and then we're gonna kind of detail some forward-thinking action items that I think you need to keep in mind as you are going through this process. There's 4 topics we're gonna touch on today, and every single topic is gonna serve you. Now, if you're actually looking to build your own propane tank smoker, you really gotta listen to this. Now with that said, let's kick off these 4 action items and let's dive into action item number 1, and that's just simply, what kind of tanks do you need? Now when I first started this journey, I knew just inherently from loving barbecue for a long time that these are predominantly built out of decommissioned propane tanks. But that's not to say that you couldn't build it out of a different style of tank. But what I will say to that point is I would advise highly against doing that. They make diesel tanks, air compressor tanks, large air compressor tanks. They make water tanks, gasoline tanks. And I think that out of every option that's available to you, the propane tank is the best route, right? As you probably know, propane, it has no taste and it has no scent. And so it's the best canvas that you could use to shove meat in there and get it hot. I wouldn't advise shoving meat in a tank that used to house diesel. Now on the topic of tanks, I think we can all agree that if we're really looking at doing this thing, what we're looking for is a decommissioned propane tank. So we can check that off the box. That's what we want. Anything else that comes our way, we're not gonna entertain it. Now moving on a little deeper into the propane tanks, let's kind of chop around what size are we looking for in that tank, what thickness on the metal are we looking for in that tank, and then also in regards to size, not just sizing meaning how many gallons of propane does it hold, 150, 180, 250, 500, etc., but also the actual shape of the tank. Because what I figured out as I was searching for my tanks is, although someone is selling a 500-gallon propane tank, that 500 gallons might be stretched out long ways, twice the size of a normal 500-gallon tank. And so now you're dealing with a super skinny tank. And contrary to that, sometimes the tanks are compressed tighter. So now you're dealing with a fatter tank. So you really need to figure out, you need to hit Google, look at different sizes of tanks, so that you know, I'm looking for a long and skinny one. I'm looking for a short and fat one. And for me, I just wanted the normal run-of-the-mill standard 500-gallon tank. Now, past size, now let's just kind of briefly talk about the steel thickness. This content is very niche to the barbecue community. And I say that because I want to just go I want to get real granular on some of these topics. And so this next item I want to talk about is just the thickness of the steel and how it relates to barbecue. The average backyard smoker that you're gonna buy from the store, if you're lucky, it's built out of 1/4-inch thick steel. And for a long time, 1/4-inch has been kind of the gold standard with backyard smokers. However, when it comes to larger units, and I'm not saying that larger units can't qualify as backyard, because it's sure as hell gonna be in my backyard, but it's just not your big box store, walk into Academy Sports and buy a smoker off the floor, right? So when you're dealing with these larger units, the thickness of the steel, it's typically double 1/4-inch. And so if you are building a 250 gallon or if you're building a 500, the reason why I'm bringing this up is because you need to be forward thinking with the materials that you're buying down the road, which is another video. I'll touch on that. Don't worry about it today. I'm just saying, if you're buying a 250-gallon propane tank, typically that steel is coming at a 1/4 inch thick. It's coming in at about a 1/4 inch or slightly more. And the second you upgrade to 500 gallons or more, that steel is gonna double, which means your cutoff wheels are doubling, the output of your plasma cutter is doubling, everything doubles. So my point in saying steel thickness is just keep in mind that there is a stark contrast between 250 and then 500 and up. Now, the last thing I want to touch on is just tank compatibility. And it kind of ties into tank sizing, but you just want to make sure that the two tanks that you're buying, because remember, the cook chamber, which is going to be my 500-gallon smoker, and then my firebox are both made out of propane tanks. Firebox is a 250 and cook chamber is a 500. Now, merging two rounded ends together inherently is difficult. But if you buy a long and skinny 500-gallon propane tank and a normal 250 propane tank for your firebox, and you think it's going to be easy to merge those, you're probably mistaken. So I would just make sure that as you're shopping for these tanks, you're keeping the compatibility of the tanks in mind. Action item number 2, where do we find the tanks? This topic is near and dear to my heart because I spent many long hours trying to figure out where to come up on a couple propane tanks without breaking the bank. And let me tell you this, in today's day and age in good old America, the prices of steel are just outrageous. And so trying to find some decommissioned propane tanks for a reasonable price, I would argue anywhere in the US is not an easy task at this point. So what I want to do is take a minute to break down what I think the best standard kind of operating procedures are when you're entering your search in an effort to help you source some tanks for the low. First place, mom and pop propane tank dealers. I would argue every city in America, or if not a neighboring city, is going to have one or two, bare minimum, mom and pop shops that sell propane tanks and they service propane tanks. And so for me, I hit these places up first, and all I did was just send in some simple phone calls, said, hey, I'm looking for some decommissioned propane tanks. Do you guys have kind of a salvage field somewhere where you're dumping these tanks off? You know, I'd ask general questions, and I wasn't able to find tanks that way, but what I can tell you is the information that they gave was actually impressively helpful. Because part of finding these tanks, you really gotta play detective. You gotta piece together little bits of info to help you get closer to what hopefully is your tank. And so a good starting point is your mom and pop propane tank dealer. And then the second place that I would suggest are the propane tank haulers or the truck drivers, the guys who are moving tanks from point A to point B. Now, these guys are incredibly helpful. I've heard of people buying these tanks directly off of these guys. But you got to keep in mind, I mean, the guys who are driving these tanks, guys or gals who are driving these tanks, they are moving sometimes decommissioned propane tanks from residential or commercial properties to the propane tank dealers, where they'll refurbish them and then send them back out into the marketplace. And so if you can intercept one of these guys at a gas station pumping some diesel in their tank, roll up on them and say, hey, I'm looking to buy a couple propane tanks for a project that I got. Would you know where I could find some decommissioned tanks? Might you have some? And it's fairly common for these guys to say, yeah, I got a couple at the house. I'll sell it to you all cash, shoot me straight. So those are, that's a good place to go. Those two items, I'd say start there. It's a good starting point. Third item, I would argue metal salvage yards or metal recycling yards. Again, people are bringing random metal and steel items to these yards where they just crunch it all up and then reuse the steel in different formats. And so sometimes you'll find decommissioned tanks sitting somewhere on that yard. And so I'd say it's just a really easy, it's kind of low-hanging fruit. If you could just Google search steel salvage yards around me and just kind of call them or roll up there, see if there's anything sitting around. It's worth a shot. I'd say explore every avenue. And so the third item to me would be metal salvage yards, because that's what I did. And fourth item would be what I like to call driving for dollars or door knocking. It's exactly what it sounds like. You're getting in your car, you're hitting, what I'd say is hit the back roads around you if you got any back roads, and just kind of drive by some residential properties where the property itself kind of looks a little distressed, maybe some overgrown vegetation. See if you can spot a tank out there. A lot of times what I'd see is there would be a tank out there maybe sitting on its side, it's not hooked up to anything, and it's sitting at an abandoned house. And so you might be able to, if you got a little skills with the interwebs, is to figure out who owns that home, give them a buzz, and when you call them, don't ask them if they're looking to sell that tank. The word track you want to use is, would you like me to remove that tank? And that person might say, thank you, Jesus, for this phone call. Yes, I want you to move this tank off my property. I hate looking at it. And that's a free way to come up on a tank. This last one is the Mac Daddy of them all. If you haven't listened to anything I've said so far, listen to this one, because this is how I found my tank, okay? Facebook forums. I know, it sounds a little crazy. Facebook forums, specifically Facebook forums geared towards barbecue, more specifically, Facebook forums geared towards propane tank smokers, and that's actually the title of the forum that I joined where I bought my tank off of. It's called Propane Tank Smokers. Okay, I don't even know where to begin on how much, how big of a wealth of knowledge that forum is, but that is, to me, the end-all be-all of kind of search options, and I'll tell you why. I believe right now there's 33,000 people that are a member of that forum, and it's a highly vetted forum. The admin audit that, which means that there's just not a bunch of crap in there. The people that are in that forum love barbecue, and they love propane tank smokers specifically. And so what I did was I just made a general post in that forum, and I said, hey, is there anyone local to, to me, Columbia, Missouri? So I said, is there anyone local to Columbia or surrounding who are selling decommissioned propane tanks? And lo and behold, I had some people comment, and sure enough, they were selling some. Now let me add this disclaimer. Before you post in a Facebook forum, specifically with 33,000 people, you need to make damn sure that you have accounted for action item number 1 that I talked about before this, which is what kind of tank do I want to buy? And let me tell you why. When something comes for sale on those forums, the amount of speed and velocity that thing moves is crazy. If someone posts, hey, I'm selling a propane tank in Killeen, Texas, there'll be 50 comments on that post within an hour. That propane tank will be sold well before you get a chance to even think about if it's a good fit, if you haven't thought about that already. So again, to summarize the Facebook forums, it's as simple as I could put it. Join the forum, post in there that you're looking for a propane tank, wait for the comments to roll in. If the comments don't roll in, what you want to do is search inside of that forum, propane tank Columbia, Missouri, or name your city, and what it'll do is it'll just aggregate any keyword that matches your search. And then something that I did was I climbed through the post that it served me up, and I personal messaged those people specifically, and I said, hey, is that tank that you posted 3 months ago, is that still available? And I was just climbing through previous posts, and eventually I was able to find a guy who was out of Kansas City. We were able to chop it up a little bit, and he sold me those tanks for an incredible price. And I'll throw in a bonus in there for you. While you're on Facebook, hit the Facebook Marketplace. It's a great place to just see what's in your area. What I would do, or what I did and what I would suggest, is just click local, no shipping. So click local inside of Facebook Marketplace, move the search radius all the way out to a 100-mile radius, search your propane tank, whatever the size is that you want, and just see what's available. I'll tell you this much. I probably found 50 to 70 different propane tanks on Facebook Marketplace. I didn't end up buying any of them, but what it helped me do was first get a general idea for what tanks are selling for in my local market. That way I know if I'm getting scammed, and I just have a general idea of how much I want to pay for this tank. And then also, it just is a good indicator of the inventory or the availability of these tanks in your area. If you do that search and only 3 tanks pop up in a 100-mile radius, well, either you might need to extend your radius, or you might just need to get a little bit more creative because the inventory in your market is low. So Facebook Marketplace is a great place to hit. Highly suggested. Action item number 3 is pricing and decision making. The propane tank market right now, for whatever reason, which I have no idea, is just, it's on fire. And so you need to be able to, at some point, make up in your mind, well before you end up buying the tank, that you're willing, able to, and ready to make this purchase. Propane tanks are selling fast, especially in the barbecue realm. So my point is, you really need to make up in your mind, how much am I willing to spend on this tank or both of my tanks, and set that well in advance so that when it comes time to making the decision, you have already thought this piece through. And so that kind of rolls into decision making, and that's just, like I said, if you have in your head figured out what you want and what you need and what your dreams are and how much you are willing to pay for it, then it makes the decision making process incredibly easy and efficient. The typical price point that I've seen in my area, which again, I'm located in central Missouri and surrounding, I've seen it about $1 per gallon. So if it's a 500-gallon tank, I'm seeing them sell for somewhere around $500, and same with a 250 and for a 1,000-gallon. Now keep in mind, there are some outliers. I have seen people try to sell a 250 literally for $950, and I've seen people try to sell a decommissioned 1,000-gallon for 500 bucks. So, you know, there are outliers, like I said, but that for me is the general price point that I've seen is about $1 a gallon or somewhere thereabout. As far as pricing is concerned, to kind of summarize or round out this topic being pricing and decision making, I paid $375 for both of my tanks. I bought a 500 and I bought a 250-gallon tank. I paid $375 for both of those. Now, something I want you to set a goal for, if you can. Now, it's difficult, it's not easy, but it's worth it. And that's to find someone selling both of the tanks that you want. So if you can find one person selling 2 tanks, that's ideal. And the reason why is because it's much easier to negotiate with that person. And so I was able to get 2 tanks for less than the price of one 500-gallon tank. And to me, that's a score. So if you can find someone who's selling 2 tanks, that's very ideal. Action item number 4. Last action item on the docket today is simply preparing for pickup and then drop off. I want to skip to the day where I took delivery of my tanks. I can't even tell you how excited I was. I was super stoked. That day culminated hours and hours and hours of searching and negotiating and messaging and searching again for propane tanks. And so what you're about to see is me trying to bottle up my excitement on my way to take delivery of 2 beautiful, beautiful propane tanks. One 500-gallon, one 250-gallon. So with that, delivery day. Delivery day. Yeah, man. We got 2 tanks en route, ETA 124 CST. Central Missouri. Man, I've searched far and wide for these tanks. So yeah, I'm on my way to the house. I got a good buddy of mine, Brian. And when I say good buddy, I've never met this guy. But and I also sent the guy a few $100 via Venmo, having never met the guy, and I don't have the tanks yet. So crossing my fingers that he shows up at 124 with these tanks. But yeah, so that's what we got going on. We'll figure out logistics when he gets there. One of our neighbors has a skid loader, has a tractor. Actually, all of our neighbors have skid loaders and tractors. So I'm hoping I can knock on a door and see if I can snag one to head up to the house and help us unload these tanks. So that's what we got going down. We'll cross our fingers. We'll say some prayers that Brian does show up with these tanks. But assuming he gets here and everything goes smoothly, we should have a 250-gallon tank and a 500-gallon tank, and we should be on our way smooth sailing to building out a 500-gallon smoker. So stand by, YouTube. We'll see. Part of the blessing with getting someone who's selling finding the same seller for both of your tanks is the fact that the logistics behind the delivery with the tanks is it's far easier than buying from two separate sellers. So, I mentioned buying both of your tanks from the same person, one, because the pricing is typically more advantageous, but two, the logistics behind picking them up and dropping them off and delivering them, it's just far easier for you. And as I kind of unpack topic number 4, which is preparing for drop off and delivery, as I unpack that, I think you'll start to understand why finding the same guy selling them is worth it. And so the first one is just having the heavy machinery required to lift these things. And this is something that I overlooked, greatly overlooked. And that's, if I have a truck and I have a trailer and I have a way to get to the tanks, does the person selling me the tank have a way to load the tanks onto my trailer? If you get creative with your tank search, the likelihood of you finding a residential homeowner selling their decommissioned tank is pretty high. The likelihood of that residential homeowner owning a skid loader or a forklift to move that tank is pretty low. So you need to be able to figure out, who am I buying this tank from? It's one thing to find a tank, it's another thing to be able to load it. So you got to math out in your head, what kind of heavy machinery is required to load this tank onto my trailer once I arrive to the tank's destination. And if I don't have a way to load this tank, that's going to cross out a segment or an avenue of tank purchase. That's going to cross out your average residential homeowner. For me, what I would suggest is see if the person selling the tank would be willing to deliver the tank to you. Now, you'll pay a fee for it, and if you're able to get your tanks at the right price, I think the benefit far outweighs any other option, and that's having the seller travel with the tanks to you. And I'll explain a few reasons why that's advantageous. If you have the tanks delivered to you, the biggest benefit, at least it was for me first, is just the anxiety of driving with massive, potentially explosive propane tanks on the back of a trailer. Was I willing to do it? For sure. But once I got up to the point where I was at the stage where I was ready to go pick up my tanks, I became far less gun-ho about the idea of traveling with those tanks. It's one thing to be a couple months outside of purchasing your tanks. It's another thing to be 24 hours outside of making that trip. And I can tell you, when you're within 24 hours of making that drive, you start to kind of think about, the worst case scenario. And so for me, I felt much better about having someone else haul those tanks into me is much easier. So that's the first option. Second option that kind of pertains to that is, when in some states it's illegal to carry a decommissioned propane tank on a trailer. And so having someone bring those tanks to you, it just circumvents the need to travel illegally with tanks, assuming that it's illegal in your area. And then third option, again, I've touched on it before, it's just the logistics of traveling. It's loading the tanks on, it's strapping them down, it's hauling them across, multiple cities or multiple counties. It's just far easier. So the ideal situation would be if you could find a seller who's selling both tanks to you at a discount, and they're willing to haul those tanks your way. That's cush. That's ideal. And by the grace of God, that's what happened to me. So it's possible. And to round out this topic right here, preparing for a pickup and drop off, is something that I grossly underestimated. This is probably the first major mistake that I made, and that is deciding where you want to unload your tanks first. Pick the area, and then making sure that that area is level and ready to receive a large propane tank on it. What I did was I didn't think about any of that. I just figured Brian is gonna bring these tanks to me. I'm gonna have neighbor Phil bring a skid loader down, load the tanks off, set them on the ground. I'll get them here, I'll take a sigh of relief, I'll figure the rest out later. Well, let me tell you something. When I filled those tanks with 500 gallons of water and soap in an effort to purge them to prepare for the cut, I did not realize that what I would be doing is filling a steel bowl full of 8,000 pounds of water. That is an immovable object. So you gotta be able to pick the area where you want to work off your tanks. Keep in mind, if you're using power tools, which are required to cut steel, that power tool needs to be in range of an outlet or in range of an extension cord, and so your tanks need to be in range of all of that. Don't set your tanks down and forget that it's not in range of your power tools, which is something else that I did. So again, pick the area where you want your tanks to be. Make sure that that area is in range of outlets that power tools connect to. And then once you picked your area, once you made sure it's in range of everything, level off the area. What I did is I bought 12 center blocks. Well, this is after I realized how stupid I was. I went out and I bought 12 center blocks. I set 6 on the left, 6 on the right, and then I lifted the tanks onto the center blocks to elevate the tank. That made working far easier than trying to work on the tank off the ground. So the last item on this topic is making sure that you're forward thinking with where you want to work with your tanks, and then making sure that that area is on a level plane, because every measurement you make on that tank is predicated off that tank being centered and level. And lastly, make sure it's close to a hose access. That's easy to forget. It's really important. You're going to be out of luck if you set your tank down and you do all this work, you level it off, you get it perfect, everything's perfect, and then you go to purge it and you look around and you realize there is no hose in sight, or the hose isn't going to reach. So make sure that you don't forget the hose. So I think at this point, it's a lot of information, it's a lot of data, and it's all really important. So I'll round out this video with kind of touching on something that's equally important but easily missed as we kind of summarize this thing here. So heavy machinery is important, it's necessary, and it's required. Skid loaders, forklifts, big pieces of machinery that can move these units. We were able to hit up a good friend who was able to help us. He has a skid loader and he brought it down. If you don't have that, you're probably going to need to rent one, which is unfortunate because it's not cheap. But these tanks are heavy and they require heavy machinery. So be forward thinking with all the heavy machinery required to move these tanks. And again, if you didn't pick out the area where you're going to set your tanks and you didn't level it off, you got one shot to do it right. If you mess it up the first time and you rented all your equipment, guess what you're going to have to do again to move it? You're going to have to rent the equipment again. I have moved my tanks, I believe, 4 times now. And again, a neighbor has helped us out, so it's not cost me anything. But I've moved tanks 4 times, and I probably have 2 to 3 more times to move it before it's all said and done. So that to me is, if you didn't get anything out of this entire video, you got to be forward thinking with where the tanks are going and how many times you're going to need to move them. I don't say this to discourage you. I say this to tell you to think ahead, because you can do it right and you can do it once, but it's going to take some planning in order to do it successfully. A lot of information. Again, thank you for attending my tank talk. We don't do TED Talks around here. It's barbecue season, it's barbecue nation, it's meet and greet. So around here we do tank talks. I appreciate you for sticking around. I hope that was helpful. I hope it was a wealth of information. This was just video 1 in the installment that is going to be my journey building a beautiful 500-gallon smoker. As always, if you have questions, I love interacting with humans in general. I love humans. So if you have questions, comments, concerns, gripes, moans, or grievances, drop them in the comments, holler at me, I'll holler back at you. I just love barbecue, man. That's all I can say. I love barbecue. I've been doing it for a long time. So it's about damn time I built a 500-gallon smoker. And so follow along. And last thing, before you leave, before you go anywhere, I'm gonna beg you. I'm literally begging you, and I don't beg for anything. Please do not make me beg. Can you subscribe to the YouTube channel? Just hit the button. That's all. Thank you. It's Big Frizz signing off. Over and out.